And for an expert to look at some of the manifesto's issues so far, we have Terence Ho, Adjunct Associate Professor in Practice from the Kuan School of Public Policy. Professor Ho, first of all, how do the four major parties differ in their vision for Singapore's future based on their latest manifestos?
Well, first of all, I think that the PAP's vision has been set out quite clearly already in the Forward Singapore report for a more inclusive and participatory society. And I think the manifesto has reflected many of the recently announced policy measures, as well as some that are in the works. And in fact, for the opposition parties, they've also touched on quite similar themes and wanting a more inclusive society, stronger safety, social safety nets and protections, and also addressing the cost of living. I think the main differences are more in terms of specific proposals, such as, for example, the introduction of minimum wage or living wages by the WP and the PSP. And of course, significant differences in terms of the vision for the housing model for Singapore. And finally, I think what's common among the major opposition parties is really the emphasis on more checks and balances and transparency, and even reforms to the political system. So I think that's where some of the similarities and major differences are. The one thing among the opposition parties I would say is that WP, or Workers' Party, maybe a bit less emphasis on immigration and foreigners compared with, say, the PSP, SDP, and other opposition parties. And for them, they touch on also broader themes that are quite similar to what the PAP has touched on as well, including the arts, sports, and even security and geopolitical issues are covered in the manifesto.
And how do the policies proposed reflect their broader political ideologies? You mentioned that cost of living is a common theme across most of the parties. Are there any others?
Yeah, so I would say that there's clearly emphasis on strengthening social safety nets or protections, things like caregivers, persons with disabilities. They're all common points that I think most of the parties do touch on with specific proposals.
Are there also consistent ideological positions, or do you think they are shifting with the political climate?
There's a degree of consistency, of course. I think we're all quite familiar with the PAP's agenda. And indeed, WP and PSP, they mentioned they're building on previous proposals, and they've been quite consistent in some of them. So I think that largely they have been championing certain issues. And as I mentioned, there's a slight divergence of emphasis between the parties, with the opposition parties emphasizing a lot more on the governance issues, checks and balances, transparency, and the emphasis for PSP, SDP, a bit more on the immigration side of things and foreigners and priority for Singaporeans and jobs.
And earlier we heard that the WP was asked about policy reversals in its manifesto. Does that signal anything? What does this mean for voters on the ground?
Well, I suppose for most of the parties, they've been fairly consistent in what they've been championing. Even for the WP, they mentioned redundancy insurance. And so some of these things are mostly quite stable. And as and when they do change, I think that also reflects that they're taking in new input.
Okay, and we also talked about cost of living issues, right? And that's covered by all parties, but their approaches differ. How do these approaches speak to what each party stands for and their ability to attract voters?
So I think that the cost of living is, of course, a very complex issue with many drivers and many different policy levers as well. So, for example, the PAP, in the most immediate manner, would give out assistance in the form of cash payouts, utilities rebates, and CDF vouchers. And in line with the sort of party ideology, a lot of emphasis is on helping Singaporeans have good jobs. So the emphasis will be on reskilling, on education, and so on. And then, of course, all the parties will also have to address the big ticket items to do with healthcare and housing. And this is where perhaps there are more significant variations. So I think by and large, everyone is focused on the cost of living, but the emphasis may differ slightly. So for instance, most of the parties would talk about whether there are alternatives to GST or whether GST should be exempted for certain items. In terms of PSP, they've touched on rents, food affordability, while the WP has focused on tiered pricing for utilities. So these are some of the differences.
But how realistic are some of these manifestos, Professor Ho, when it comes to cost and implementation? Do you think voters will take that into account when deciding who to support?
Yes, of course, some of the proposals, the really major ones to do with housing, it's hard to say exactly how implementable they are yet, because they involve very massive changes to the existing system. But for other measures that are suggested, I think these can be sort of costed, and it's easier for the voters to see whether these are things that resonate with them, whether it's in terms of rentals, in terms of food costs, in terms of childcare costs.
And which party's manifesto do you think speaks most directly to young voters?
So the overall manifesto, I think they all have their own strengths. So for example, the Workers' Party, we talk about working for Singapore. I think the idea is that I think they're trying to reflect the commitment to the good of Singapore and that they are working hard on industrious. The PAP, of course, also has a longer slogan, but again, I think there were certain elements that they tried to bring up to emphasize the changing world, the idea that we're facing a new set of challenges, and hence also a fresh team in place, reflecting the leadership succession and the new resolve. So harking back a bit to the sort of stability and trust that Singaporeans have in the ruling party, while injecting a measure of a freshness and the new challenges and a brighter future ahead. So I think there are various strengths in the different manifestos. For PSP, of course, it's very simple. Progress for all, reflecting the party's name.
All right, Professor Ho, appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us tonight. That was Terence Ho, Adjunct Associate Professor in Practice from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.